So let's pick up where we left off. So we've basically made something that we can switch between video sources and have be successful. So let's see how we can do some other things with the images that we've got. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to stop the video in device. If I just make this active off, it's going to keep this same frame here, but it's frozen. So you can see me with my mouth like partially open in this beautiful office that I call an office. And I may go ahead and just switch this to the banana image as well, or one of the butterflies, just because we don't need video for this part. So I'm going to go ahead and select this movie file in. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to find wherever the banana is. It's the very first one. There we go. I'm going to open this up. Okay. So we've got these three sources. Again, they should still be switching like they were before. It shouldn't be any change. I'm going to maybe make my LFO go a little bit faster just so we can see those switching. So we're going to go ahead and leave that in its current state. And then what we can do is we can take these and we can actually feed these into other elements. And so one of the ways that we can blend things like you would blend two layers in Photoshop. So if you've ever used Photoshop, you know, right, that it has different layers, and each layer has essentially a blend mode. It's set to normal by default, and you can do add, subtract, multiply, divide, difference, etc., right? And all of those different things are a different way of blending the color of the two images. So if we go ahead and double click off here in space, go to the purple, right? Go to our tops. And if we type in comp, C-O-M, right, we get composite. And let's go ahead and create a composite operator. And with this composite operator, what we're going to do is we're just going to start by doing the top two options. So we're going to feed in this ABP Galactic, and we're going to feed in this movie file. And then we're going to zoom in or maybe make this full screen. Oops, that was the wrong button. There we go. Right, so you can see right now I've got those two sources going in here, and my operation, the default operation is multiply. Right, and so with this I can swap my order of operations, and in this case that's not really going to do anything different. But what does multiply do, right? It's multiplying the color value of each one of the pixels here by the color value of the pixel here. So in this area in the outside, right, that's totally, one, it's totally transparent, and two, it would basically be black if it wasn't transparent, so it's multiplying it by 0, and so you would get 0, right? We're not getting anything there. But then inside we're getting yellow times blue or yellow times this like gold material that I've got on there. So if we go here, we can just change the way that these things blend together. So if I say subtract, right, we're going to get a very different result. If I say add, we will, right, be adding those two images together. So I get that. You can see the image between there. If I switch this order, I want you to note that what's going to happen is because this movie file in it's basically taking, you can see that, right, I'm getting this change because one of these sources is is controlling, right, the dimensions of this, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to mainly focus on getting our things together. If you swap order of operation, what that does is, in this case, it's not really making a difference for add, but what it does is it basically does the same thing, but you won't get the change in format. So if I was to say a top, right, this is going to put, right, one of these on top of the other. And you can see that in this case, a top with my banana is asking, it's acting like a opacity mask, right? And so in the other case, right, this is laying on top of the background, but the background, right, doesn't have any opacity information on there. It's just 100% opaque. So we can do chroma difference, right? We can go through and you can click through all of these and see what you like. Pin light's kind of hilarious. I might leave it on difference for now. And if I swap that order, again, not going to make a difference in this case. But in some cases it does. It really just depends on the two images and what mode you're working in. Let's see here. So I'm going to keep it on difference because I really like the pink and orange on that banana. It's making me happy with the way the background looks. So then one thing too is like, well, how can I get this to maybe blend a little bit differently or not as intensely? And so, right, we've got this, it's just a switch. There's no real way to fade between these two. However, we can use a switch, and we can actually take this output and feed it into our switch as it stands and go to our go up to our source of control, which is our LFO. And instead of having this amplitude be 3, we could make this amplitude 4. And then as we go through, you'll see that it's going to cycle up to this additional source, right? So we could also, if say we're using this as our base image, and we want to blend between these two, what we can do is we can go ahead and create another switch down here. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to go to switch, wherever that is. If I can't see it, I'm going to type SW until I find it. There it is. And I'm going to go ahead and feed this in one value, feed this in as my second value. And then I'm going to go ahead and blend between inputs up here. And now I can come in, right, and I can actually blend these together. Now, this is one of those cases where what I should probably do is go to my common, and for my output ratio, or aspect ratio, I should say custom, and I'm just going to change this to 16:9 so we don't get that popping action between the two layers, right? And so now with this switch, right, I can go in and I can essentially blend this in so that the banana is either all the way there or it's kind of vanishing off into the background, right? So this is another way that I can, after I've applied this effect, I can go in and kind of blend it in or make it more or less strong, right? Let's see here. What else should we do? So that's like a simple way to do that. I'm going to turn this off so we can actually see, right? And so you can see that we start to get kind of a mess. Networks are messy, and being able to adjust these and move things around helps you see where connections are. What's nice too is that if you hover over one of these wires, you can actually see where that connection is. Okay, so we've got those, we've got that switch set, so we can blend between these two things. There are a lot of other operators that we can use on our projects. So if I come in here and I'm going through here, there's other things that we frequently will want to do. One of those is we oftentimes want to be able to adjust the hue, saturation, and vibrance, right? We want to be able to do some color correction, to tweak our colors. You may look down here and you may see things that also look like things that you would be able to do, effects or filters you'd be able to put on in Photoshop or some other image editing program. And so you can see there's like displace and edge and emboss. Feedback takes a little bit more work, but let's go ahead and see what some of these do. One of the ways to learn what different things do is first, when you hover over them, a lot of them will tell you what they do, right? It says the feedback top can be used to create feedback effects in tops. That's pretty exciting. And that's like a visual feedback. Emboss, right? It embosses it like a thin sheet of metal. Edge, it basically finds the edges. Displace is going to cause one image to be warped by another. That's kind of pretty cool. Cross is basically just a cross dissolve, right? It's similar to what we're doing with the switch here, but it just does it between two images. There's a bunch of other options in here. Now, let's go ahead and we are going to start by, what was I going to show you? I just totally forgot. Oh, we were going to do some color adjustments. So let's go ahead and create this HSV adjust. So I've got this HSV adjust. I'm going to feed my output from this switch in here. And you'll see that I've got my HSV adjust. And then there's all of these settings here, right? The ones up here basically set the range and fall off and all of that. What we really are looking at are for the bottom three are the ones that make the differences. It's hue, offset, saturation, and value. And you've probably seen these elsewhere, right? You can, if I click and drag this, it goes from -360 to 360, so I can cycle through these colors. I can very easily use an LFO and I can just set the amplitude to 360, and then I can control this, right? So if we want to see that, let's go ahead and take a look. So we're going to go ahead and go chop. We're going to go down to our LFO, put this here. Let's change our amplitude to 360. Let's go ahead and do the same thing we did before, viewer active. We're going to select our hue saturation. I'm going to click this. I'm going to drag this into my hue offset, export chop. And this is going really fast. So I'm going to select my LFO. And remember, I can't get this attributes up if I'm in the viewer active mode. I have to turn that off. And then I can drop my frequency down, let's say substantially. So this is a nice slow fade, right? So now I've got this like slow fade through these colors, right? It's pretty cool. Right? And so you can see how you can pretty quickly, once you start to know what these things do, or the basics, the basics of how to connect the different operators together, we can work pretty quickly to develop some unique unique networks, right? So if we just keep experimenting and playing, if we double click and we say, oh, let's go back to our tops, and we're going to go down and let's just see what happens if we put an edge one here and feed this into our edges. If we go ahead and look at this, you'll see that, right, it has outlined all these edges in white, right? And so in this, I can, crank the strength up so things are a little bit more intense. I can dial that strength down so it's softer. The black level I can increase, which basically makes the contrast higher. Like if I increase the strength but increase the black level, you can kind of see that that gets either noisier or a lot of the dimmer tones are dropped out. I can change the edge color, so I can, I could make these edges red or green or yellow or, orange, whatever color I'd like them to be. And there's some other things I can multiply. Doesn't seem to really do anything in this case. You can also set the alpha, right? So by default, the alpha is only where there's edges is it opaque. And so it's using like a grayscale map of those edges to set the opacity of the layer, or the alpha. Or I can either say it should be opaque or it should, oops. Oh, well, we're going to talk about that in a second. Or, it should just be, it should default to being transparent except where these layers are. And then also I can comp over input, right? So I can take the input signal and basically draw those edges on top of that. And when I do that, you'll see that this gets grayed out because there's only one way that that functions. Again, pre-multiplying doesn't seem to make any difference in this case in the visual output. The sample steps are another setting that we can do. So if I was to, I'm going to turn comp over input off. And I might actually just go ahead and set this to have a black background for the time being to make it a little easier to see what's going on. But if I do a sample step of 4 in this first value, you're going to see what happens is that's 4 in the X, right? X is horizontal values from 0 to the maximum screen width, or 0 to 1, potentially. It depends on what it's using. But it's actually like streaking that out, right? And if I do 4 in both, right, then I'm going to get like a much different thing. You can see that all of these points that were individual points are basically being spread out. I don't know how else to describe it. If I dial the black value down, you can kind of see the impact that this has. And you can create some really interesting effects with this. So if I was to say, let's do this vertically, let's say 10, right, you just get some really interesting, glitchy, artifacty weirdness. And these are all values you can change over time, right? So let's look at using something other than an LFO to control some of these values. So if I double click off in space and I create a chop, there's this beat chop down here, right? And if you can't find it, just type BEA and you should find it. And the beat chop, what this does is this is based on, it's a ramp, you can see, so it's going up and then it cuts to 0. And what this is based on is it's based on the tempo of our project. So if I select this operator, you'll see there's some other settings here, period, steps, whatever. If I go to output, what I can do is I can turn on a bunch of different possible values that I can get out of this. So if I go to beat, you'll see that I get 0, 1, 2, 3, and that repeats forever. And the reason it's repeating in 4/4 time right now, I believe is here. Like if I was to say set this to 3, not 34, 4, 3/4 time, it should go 1, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, right? So that's my time signature down here. If I was to do like 6/8 time or whatever, I could do that as well, but we're just going to keep it at 4/4. And then the tempo is how quickly, right, the beat's going. If I was to say, set this down to, let's just do 90 instead of 120, you're going to see that those beats take a lot longer. And I actually am going to go down to 60 because I want this to go, these changes to be slow and not too abrasive. Okay, and then let's look at our output again. So there's a bunch of different things we can output, right? We can do a sine wave that's based on the tempo. So if we made changes to tempo, that would adjust. We can have our 16th beats, right? So there's 4/16ths per beat. So if we need more resolution on those steps, we can do that. We can actually output the BPM itself, which, so if we turn this on, you'll see that that is set to 60. You can do the ramp beat, which is basically ramping up between each one of these beats. And right, there's just a whole bunch of different options. So let's go ahead and see what we can change here. So we're going to go ahead and let's see what happens if we crank the strength all the way. Well, let's say our strength goes from 0 to 1, but maybe that's not what we want. Let's start by leaving our strength pretty high, and let's go ahead and see what happens when we go through these sample steps. Now, we may have an issue if this is 0, and it may give us an error. So I'm going to go ahead and save my project right now, and I'm going to call this Toot 2. And put this in this folder and save it. Okay. So I've saved this because I'm not sure if I'm going to crash something when I do this. So let's go ahead and we're going to make our viewer active. And I want to use this beat value for this sample step. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this out here, drop it in here, and say chop reference. Okay. And you can see, right, I'm getting these pops between these different values. Now, I don't know if you can input percentages. It looks like you can do fractions in here as well. So that might be something where maybe we try and do the ramp on this other one. Let's see what we get. But right now, we're using these whole number values. And so you can see I can control these different settings based on that. Let's go ahead and actually, let's see if we can... I don't know if we can ramp through our color effectively, but let's go ahead and see. Let's see if we can just throw this into our, let's throw this into our value and see if we can actually do it. No, so what this is doing is when I go into this color mode, it's only setting that one value, unfortunately. And if I go here, it will do a single, right? It's only going to do a single channel, if that makes sense, right? This is red, green, and blue, and this is going to be my opacity, or my alpha. And so, right, so it's only doing that one value right now. There's a couple extra steps we would need to do to make a different change. But for now, honestly, right, this is good enough. It's showing us, right, kind of some of the possibilities in terms of how we can use these different settings to do this. So let's go ahead and let's see what happens if I boost my tempo to 120. All right, so you can see now I'm getting, right, a much faster change here. And if I go ahead and say comp over input, right, so we can see all of that at once, right? Now we've got something that's already, we're getting a lot more visual information, noise, some complexity in here that we didn't have before. And so you can kind of see how, right, even with these basic tools, we're not even moving anything on the screen right now. We're just adjusting these values, using time, and using different methods to work with things over time. Okay. That's where we're going to end this section of the tutorial, right? We've learned a fair amount about how to build networks using TouchDesigner and some of these other options. Now, there is one last thing, because there's always one last thing that I want to show you before we end this one. And that is if I right-click on one of my operators, in this case, I'm going to right-click on the edge operator. There's a bunch of different options in here. There's parameters, which if I click that, it's actually going to pop this up in a free floating window that allows me to see those parameters. It's pretty helpful. If I go to info, it's going to give me some info about what this thing is doing. At this point in our life, it doesn't really matter, but it is telling us like what image format and all of these other things are being used, how much memory this is actually taking, and how much I have in total available. If I right click on this again, if I go to operator, if I go to help, what it's going to do is it's going to open up the documentation for this operator on TouchDesigner's website. And it kind of tells you what each one of these things does. It's all right. Some of it's pretty technical, and it doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know, but it'll get you started. But one of the more useful ones is here. You can go to operator snippets. If I click on operator snippets, what this does is it basically gives you little example networks using the operator, right? So in this case, it takes the banana and it applies some settings here. We didn't even talk about the options here. You can just do the red, or you can basically split it out and do some interesting things with it, but that doesn't really matter. And then over here, there's this other this other example, and this is more complex, right? And we haven't talked about creating shapes that move around on the screen at all, but you can see that this is a noise operator, and we have this tx and ty values that are being used to move this around x and y. And then there's a whole bunch of things happening here in order that are using edges. And so it shows a bit more complex example of things you can do with this. And there's and you can do that with any of these. If I click on emboss, it's going to show you what emboss does. Some of them only have one example, some of them have more. It really just depends on the project. And in this case, it shows you a bunch of different options. And something's a little broken over here, but we're not going to worry about that too much. But so you can go through and you can find out what each of these things does. Like if I'm like, what the heck does analyze do? You can see it basically splits out what these different, what the different outputs are. There's a lot of possible examples in terms of, what this does. Lag is something we'll talk about later, but it's a really great tool where basically you click a button and then it, or you pulse something, but then it jumps up to that new value, or it slowly increases that value. You can overshoot with it. You can create really kind of organic motion. Anyway, there's a bunch of different options in here. And so, I just wanted to show that these snippets can be really, really helpful. Oh, and the other thing with snippets, you can always copy that network and paste it into yours, so you don't even have to go go back and forth between the two. You can just grab all those operators and then work from there. Okay. In the next tutorial, we will look more at chops, but actually using chops, the green ones, in order to manipulate sound. All right, that's all we got.